How do democracies reflect illiberal thought or practices? In 1948, the South African Apartheid started. Apartheid is a policy or system of segregation or discrimination based on race. The National Party of South Africa started this racial segregation or discrimination against black South Africans. This party passed laws in which the black population was required to carry these things called passbooks with them when they left their homes or other designated areas. If a person failed to show their passbook, they would be arrested. Not just the police, but also any white person, including children, could ask a black South African to show his or her passbook. In response to the apartheid, global trade was reduced with South Africa, and they became isolated from the world. International banks started refusing to loan the country money, and South Africa was not allowed to participate in the Olympics from 1964 onward. The apartheid was especially hard for women in South Africa, as they were not only being discriminated against for race, but also gender. The discrimination against women was different to that of men, as they did not have the same rights as men to begin with. They did not have access to an education or the right to own land. Jobs were also very hard for women to find, as working was the man's job, and wages were very low. Marriage and birth rate was controlled by the government in an effort to lower the African birth rate. In 1912, the African National Congress was established to end the apartheid. The members wanted liberation movements. Nelson Mandela started out as the leader, but later became the president of the ANC. At first, the ANC tried to use laws and civil disobedience to protect black South Africans, but later turned to acts of violence in retaliation for similar acts by the South African government. In years following, the Pan-Africanist Congress split from the ANC because they did not agree with the ANC working to improve the situation for other non-white groups being discriminated against. This group included people from China or the Chinese South Africans. The PAC focused on black power. While these groups were using resistance movement tactics to protest like sit-ins, boycotts, and strikes, the government used repression tactics like arresting, torturing, and jailing people. On March 21, 1960, the PAC announced that it would be conducting a mass nonviolent protest of the pass laws by holding a national strike. Pass laws came into effect when Prime Minister Hendrik was in power. He wanted to develop a policy of separate development. If Africans wanted to travel anywhere or even work, they needed a pass showing that they were allowed out of their designated section. If an African was found without their passes or traveling outside the regulated boundaries, they would be arrested and put in jail for a minimum of 30 days. The passes were made to keep Africans in their place and to regulate their ability to move and their freedom. To the people of South Africa, the passes represented lost freedom. The PAC did not like these laws because it was a form of discrimination and was generally unnecessary for there to be a law like this. Many groups of Africans surrounded police stations as part of the nationwide protest. The South African government was determined to disperse the crowds using military flyovers, tear gas, and riot police. In Sharpeville, 5,000 to 7,000 people gathered in a peaceful demonstration. After the crowd did not leave, the government started shooting people. Police officers stood on roofs of vans spraying wide arcs of machine gun fire directly into the panicked crowds. By the end of it all, 69 people were dead and almost 200 were wounded, men, women, and children. Most had been shot in the back as they ran from the shooting. To cover it up, the government said the protesters were becoming aggressive and throwing rocks. Laws were then passed, and the ANC and the PAC were outlawed, and the leaders were found and imprisoned. After the protest, a state of emergency was declared, and thousands of black Africans were arrested. In response to the international protest, South Africa withdrew from Commonwealth and declared itself a republic. The ANC and the PAC turned to more extreme actions such as attacks on government buildings, bombing, and other terrorist tactics. Nelson Mandela became a symbol of the fight to end apartheid. He was an anti-apartheid activist working to free the people from discrimination. As part of his peaceful protest, he burned his passbook to stand up for the liberation movements. Nelson Mandela achieved many things during the apartheid, including achieving freedom and equal rights for every South African, which contributed to his popularity and respect in South Africa. These rights being taken away from the Africans does not show liberalism. He was arrested in 1962 and sentenced to 5 years hard labor for starting the workers' strike and leaving the country illegally. But being in prison did not stop him from fighting the apartheid. Even in his jail cell, he was fighting to end the apartheid. 2 years later, Mandela, along with other ANC leaders, were put on trial for plotting to overthrow the government with violence. In the late 1980s, the white rulers became aware that the apartheid was indefensible and began to slowly reduce the policies of apartheid. On February 11, 1990, apartheid declined and Nelson Mandela was free from prison. The same year, ANC was again free to exist in South Africa. In 1994, the first interracial election occurred, resulting in the ANC winning and making Nelson Mandela the first black president of South Africa. The apartheid was ended by a series of negotiations from 1990 to 1993. These negotiations were between the governing National Party and the African National Congress and many other political organizations. Apartheid ended so quickly that it took many people in South Africa and throughout the world by surprise. The ANC agreed to the Groot Schuur Minute, which means they made a commitment to end the violence. A group was assigned to discuss important issues like the release of political prisoners, while the government started to review the security legislation to ensure free political activity. After many negotiations, the apartheid was ended and South Africans were free to live without passbooks and with rights they had been fighting for years.